here. And thank you to the Ellis Institute for hosting us, and for Dr. DiGiuseppe for preparing and delivering this talk. My name is Dennis Tursch. I'm the president-elect of the New York City CBT organization, and I'm filling in for Susan Evans, who is our president. And I have the honor of introducing Ray. He asked me to keep it brief because he's a modest guy, and I would say that this is a person who is central to the world of CBT in New York, but he is actually central to the world of CBT, period. So we'll have a few highlights of Ray's bio. He is the Director of Professional Education here at the Ellis Institute. He has a long and storied tenure here, training hundreds of CBT professionals, very, very active in the training of cognitive behavior therapists here and around the world. Past president of ABCT, author of 6 books, over 120 chapters and articles, developed scales and assessment measures, and an innovator throughout the different generations, or perhaps some would say waves of CBT. We're really lucky to be here with Ray tonight, and I'm for one very much looking forward to his talk. So without further ado, Dr. DiGiuseppe.
Okay, who was that guy? So let me tell you why I'm interested in the Dodo bird effect. And there's kind of sort of a little story to this. I'll sort of tell you a little story. Back in the 2000s, John Norcross, who you may know of various fame, and asked me to be a member of the publication board of Division 29 of Psychotherapy. I'd always been a member of Division 29 of Psychotherapy since I was, I guess, a new psychologist, so I agreed to do it. But he said that he wanted me to be the member of the publications board because they needed a token CBT person. That they didn't have too many CBT people, and since this was, I think we were kind of approaching the majority of psychotherapists, maybe they should have somebody on the publication board to represent that. So, I had always really traveled in ABCT circles, and I had really always gotten to know people who thought a lot like me. I didn't really have to talk to too many people who thought differently than me. And if I ran across them at the university, it was easy to ignore them. And so that's really what I had done. Also, probably many of you don't know that, at least if you were as old as I, there was a time when if you had a CBT moniker around your name, people thought you were the lunatic fringe. Most people don't sort of remember, but when Joe Wolpe did his first talk on systematic desensitization at the American Psychiatric Association, people laughed at him and walked out. When Tim Beck did his first study on cognitive therapy of depression, he had the deck stacked against him. All the residents who served as therapists were trained in psychoanalysis and believed it to be superior, and his co-collaborator believed that the medication would work, and they were just going along with this to get the grant money. So Tim was really kind of out there on his own, and really kind of a brave guy. I don't think people give Tim the credit for the bravery that he had of sort of like fighting the paradigm that had existed at the time. And I was one of the only, it was back in the 1970s when I started to work after I graduated, there were 3 cognitive behavior therapists or behavior therapists at Long Island Jewish where I worked, and that's all there were. And I once successfully treated a kid with encapricis, and after having treated this kid rather successfully, a kid who had been treated by the psychiatric psychodynamic fellow for 4 years with no success, the head of psychiatry said to me, "Don't ever embarrass the department like that again." So, there was a time when we were really kind of out there and really thought that we were kind of a lunatic fringe. And so I guess people kind of isolated themselves from others because, we weren't treated so nicely. So here I was on this publication board, and I was meeting people of different theoretical orientations and talking to them, and I liked them. they were nice people, and they seemed to make sense, and they said a lot of smart things, and I was kind of introduced to other points of view that I had not heard of for maybe a long time, but in a much more collegial way than had been the case in the 70s. And so that was kind of the issue. And then I stayed on the Division 29 leadership. Presently, I'm president of the Division of Psychotherapy, which I can't figure out how that ever happened. But you know, I'm interested in this issue, and the thing that I'm most interested in is this APA resolution that all psychotherapies, you know, the APA passed this resolution that psychotherapy works, which is really a very good thing for all of us, and passed this resolution, and it says that, you know, kind of everything's equal. So this idea of that all psychotherapies have equal worth has really been around for a long time, and it is called the Dodo bird hypothesis. And the dodo bird comes from Alice through the Looking Glass, Alice in Wonderland. And it really is ironic because it's meant to mean that all things are equal, but in the story, we don't know who wins the race because there really is no race, and people talk about the race, but there is no race. We really don't know who won the race, and it's not true that everything is equal. So, you know, it is kind of a little bit of a misnomer, but it has been the thing that has stuck around, this idea that all psychotherapies have equal effectiveness. And this has really been around since the 1930s. So we really have like an 85-year-old hypothesis that's kicking around saying all bona fide psychotherapies therapies are equal. Now, do we really believe that? And when this sort of came out, in other words, if we look at the history for this, in 1975 there was this big meta-analysis in psychotherapy by Smith and Glass. They found that systematic desensitization was had the largest effect size. REBT had the second largest effect size, and followed a few others. But the overall effect sizes were really not that discrepant. And so, you know, there was this issue that, okay, there may be small differences, but they're not that great. And so that kind of fueled the dodo bird effect, depending on how much you thought an effect size had to be different. And then the NIMH collaborative study was done where they compared VEX, cognitive therapy, versus medication and interpersonal therapy. And cognitive therapy didn't do as well, and interpersonal therapy did okay. So this sort of like stuck around there. And then came along the proponents of Division 12, Division of Clinical Psychology, who sort of said, you know, we should develop a criteria for empirically supported treatments. And this became an extremely controversial issue because the idea was we were going to put out a list of therapies that were, you know, had empirical support. And that list is still around, and you can go to those two websites, the Division 12 websites for adult disorders and Division 53 of APA for the child disorders, and there's a set of criteria which people have talked about. Now, let me just say that the president of Division 12, the president of ABCT, Dean McKay, and people on this committee, and myself are kind of revisiting what these criteria should be and thinking about whether or not we should change them and whether or not they should be a little more rigorous than they were since they were developed a while ago. So there's some discussion about whether or not these things should be changed. But we do have these things. These were considered really hostilely by the rest of the world of psychotherapy. I think if you were a CBT researcher, then this was really kind of a good thing. Now, while I was involved in CBT and ABCT, the cognitive behavior therapy people always talk about dissemination, right? How do we disseminate our empirically supported therapies to the rest of the world? And here I was serving on a divisional of APA board with other people who, I was the only CBT person there. And it occurred to me that my colleagues in ABCT had sort of missed the boat. That the people that we were trying to disseminate to kind of viewed us as Jehovah's Witnesses knocking on their door, trying to convince them of something that they didn't want to be convinced of, and that they were, not interested in. And they thought what they were doing was really just fine, and that attempts to disseminate information were really kind of ridiculous and really not very important. And so, how are we going to convince them that cognitive behavior therapy had something to offer, because they didn't really think so? And so, I kind of thought that, gee, I go to these ABCT meetings and people talk about dissemination, and I go to these other meetings that are supposed to be the target of the dissemination, and they don't want to be the target. They're not the least bit interested in giving up what they do because they think what they do has value. And so maybe we really need to engage in some kind of dialogue with these people and sort of figure out what we can come to some common ground. So I really changed my position on dissemination as a result of this experience, because I believe that sometimes the disseminated to don't always want to be listened to. People don't always. Sometimes I listen to things on dissemination and CBT, and I feel like I'm at the Book of Mormon, that people really don't want to be proselytized to. So anyway, that's sort of one of the issues. And then came along this idea that we're going to replace empirically supported treatments with empirically based practice. And there was a great big debate about empirically based practice and whether empirically based practice, what the standards should be. There was a big APA commission, and Carol Goodhart, who was later president of APA, and Dave Barlow were on this. And really the guidelines for empirically supported practice were kind of reduced to things that made sense, but that you should look at randomly controlled trials, you could look at what worked for this particular client, but the evidence was really less on the science and more on the clinician's experience. And so there's been this back and forth. So one of the things, and then we have this APA resolution now, the Division of 29, of which I presently am strongly involved in, was very active in passing this through APA Council, and it really says, the underlying parts, variation in outcomes are more heavily influenced by patient characteristics, for example, the chronicity, complexity, social support, and intensity of the disorder, and by the clinician and context factors than by any particular diagnosis or significant treatment brands. And so when this came out, I sort of posted it to the ABCT listserv. Nobody said anything. There was almost like no response. It's like people didn't say anything. Like, do you think that people in ABCT believe this? Think they believe it? No, I don't believe it, but nobody was commenting on it. And so why am I being such a fool to comment on it? Why are we going to do this? What can we learn from this? And so, whereas the comparisons of different forms of psychotherapy most often result in relatively non-significant differences, and contextual and relationship factors often mediate or moderate these outcomes, these factors suggest that most valid and structured psychotherapies are roughly equivalent in effectiveness in patients and therapist characteristics which are not usually captured by a patient's diagnosis or by the therapist's use of specific psychotherapy affect the results. So these other variables kind of affect the results. So let me ask you a question. Could it be that the Dodo effect is really true? That maybe both are true? Maybe there are these lots of other variables that do influence psychotherapy outcome, but there really are sort of individual differences in treatment. So how do we sort of do that, sort of make a comment on this? And so one of the things that I think that we have in this empirically supported treatment modality is that we have a lot of disorders. And for each disorder, we sort of develop, there's a list of all the empirically supported treatments that you could have, all the disorders for which you could have an empirically supported treatments. And what's the likelihood that somebody here in full-time private practice could learn to do all these treatment manuals? Do you have a shelf big enough for all these treatment manuals? Could you really deliver the treatment manuals with fidelity? And so one of the things that I think is a threat to the idea of empirically supported treatments is that we have a proliferation of manuals and disorders that would be overwhelming for anyone to operate on and learn. So, how many of these books do you have on your bookshelf? And could you incorporate them all? So I think this has created a little bit of a crisis. So if you're a cognitive behavior therapist, how do you learn all these things? Okay, so I'd like to spend some time sort of talking about the other position. In other words, it's hard to debunk a position unless you know what it says. You can't sort of falsify a hypothesis and have science progress unless you know what the alternative explanations are. So I think that these CBT people would say, we have these therapies that have active ingredients, and that we develop active ingredients, and we explore them, and we have these ECTs, studies that show that they work. The alternative view that is probably espoused by the majority of psychotherapy researchers who don't attend the same conferences as CBT people is the common factors approach. So if you went to the Society for Psychotherapy Research, you would run across people who would do research in this area. Anybody go to the Society for Psychotherapy Research? How did I know that? Okay. So that there's a whole lot of people who publish in good scientific journals, who do psychotherapy research, who really believe in this common factors approach. And I don't think we can sort of test the common factors approach and engage in a scientific debate unless we sort of understand it. And so there's a guy, Bruce Wampold. Bruce Wampold is from the University of Wisconsin, and he's written this book called The Great Psychotherapy Debate. It's going to be out in its second edition. It's really a very good read. I mean, it reads he's a very good writer. And he's got an article in the American Psychologist in 2007 that sort of proposes this. And I guess I'm kind of making fun of him a little bit with that picture I had up there. That he really says that psychotherapy is sort of one of the healing, changing process activities, and that it shares a lot with some other kind of activities, such as medicine and religious interventions, such as shamans and priests, and that there are these common elements that allow for change. And so Wampold would argue that there's three real mechanisms that people would say cause change in human behavior. One is a biological theory. There are biological theories. We have sort of neurotransmitter problems in our brains for which we take SSRIs. Another is we have psychological theories like cognitions or learning history or whatever the case may be. And we have spiritual ones. And that these are different explanations for why people have problems, and they lead to scientific versus non-scientific types of interventions, and they lead to either a medical model or what he would call a contextual model. And so we have these different explanatory conditions. They can be scientific or non-scientific, and they could be medical or contextual. And according to Wampold, we would be sort of in the medical model. We follow that there's a specific disorder, and the specific disorder has a specific mechanism that has caused this problem, and we want to have a specific intervention that's going to work on that mechanism that causes the disorder, versus a contextual approach. And the contextual approach is really what is called the common factors hypothesis. There are common factors as to what makes behavior change occur, and that we really want to look at these kinds of common factors. So that's where he would go. So this idea that there are common factors in psychotherapy is not new to Wampold. It goes back to Jerome Frank, which was a book published really back in the 1970s called Persuasion and Healing, although I always thought persuasion was somewhat of a cognitive intervention. So, but Frank sort of makes this idea that, he sort of did this research where he got people to fill out symptom questionnaires and then sort of looked at who came for therapy, and he found that people sort of come for that they show improvement when they make the appointment. So once you decide to get therapy, you're getting better because you have a little hope. So Frank sort of got this idea that people have demoralization, and once they become remoralized, which going to therapy helps. They automatically start to get better a little bit. And this whole idea of demoralization and remoralization really ended up in the revision of the MMPI-2RF. In other words, the new factor in the first scale in the refactor analysis of the MMPI-2RF is demoralization questions that are very similar to what Jerome Frank talked in. I guess back 91 is his most recent book. So Frank sort of argued that you have these common factors, and the common factors are an emotionally charged, confidential relationship with someone in a healing role. So, people have made the analogy between psychotherapists and clergy for a very long time, and they sort of see us as clergy. So you want to have this relationship with someone special. You want to have a healing setting. Very few of us are going to go to Jimmy's Barbecue down the block and do a psychotherapy session. Right? There's a place that we have, our office, and there's certain decor, that people have a rationale or a conceptual theme. That there's a reason that we try to explain why people have the problem that they have, and there's a concept. And all the research in placebos shows that people don't benefit from placebo unless they think the placebo has a plausible explanation to work. So having a plausible explanation for the nature of the treatment is a necessary component for a placebo to believe placebo, which then leads people to say that a placebo really isn't a placebo. Placebo in medicine is an inert substance, but there's this belief that somehow it's going to work. So you have to have that rationale, and you have to have certain procedures that the healer or patient believe in, or that are part of the, certain things that you have to do. We have to sort of identify their dysfunctional thoughts and maybe teach them new ones and teach them how to do homework assignments, or maybe we have to teach them how to analyze their past experiences, and that there's a positive expectation for change. So if we go back to Jerome Frank, we see that these common factors are identified there. The medical model, as Wampold would say, says that there are different treatments. Each treatment has an active ingredient. In other words, there's something in exposure that's active, that's different from supportive therapy. Different treatments you would use for different disorders. What you might use for a phobia is different than what you might use for trichotillomania. You have different theories of the mechanism of change underlying these things, and that you use outcome or efficacy studies to determine what works, and that adherence to the treatment is kind of important. So in other words, this does follow somewhat of a medical model or a pharmacological model, that the therapy has to be specific and has to carry over for each time, and there's certain things that we believe in. I don't particularly like the term medical model, but I guess it sort of fits. So Wampold would argue that. And so the contextual theory models would sort of say that, the theories and techniques are somewhat irrelevant, not important. The common factors cut across all therapies. In other words, those things that Frank talked about probably occur with whether or not you're doing, Rogerian therapy or psychodynamic therapy or cognitive behavior therapy. That we need to find more of these common factors, we need to measure them, and that these sort of non-specific effects, as they're often called in therapy, really are more specific. They really do account for lots of the variables, and so that's really kind of an important issue. Whereas the medical model kind of predicts that some therapies will be more effective than others because there's a specific mechanism that causes the disorder and there's a specific mechanism of change. So, Wampold really argues in the great psychotherapy debate that we really haven't supported this idea that different therapies work differentially. And again, does everybody agree with this? So let's take, for example, most psychotherapy research. And since reading the great psychotherapy debate, and I sign this in class, this book all the time, it occurs to me that Wampold has a point, that very rarely do we compare a bona fide psychotherapy to another bona fide psychotherapy what we tend to do is to establish that a psychotherapy is effective by comparing it to a placebo waiting list, minimally effective treatment like supportive therapy or something like that. And so that the comparison or control condition is really rather weak. And so Wampold would argue, no matter how much support you have, that your therapy is better than one of these comparisons, you don't really have support that it's better than something else. That's because you haven't really compared it to another effective therapy, you're just comparing it to some other placebo or common factor. So that would be part of his debate. We really often failed to do a good job at showing that the medical model, what we do, has important elements. So if we, that the elements that we say are important are really kind of important. So if we go back to systematic desensitization that had a very effective history, and people started to do a components analysis, is the relaxation necessary? No. Is the hierarchy necessary? Some people said no. There's really one component that turned out to be necessary, which was exposure, right? And maybe the others aren't exposure. So that's one example. I have this sort of bolognese sauce example that I would like to use. Everybody know what bolognese sauce is? You have pasta bolognese sauce. Now, I kind of am a serious Italian cook. I really like to cook. And let's suppose I have 20 different Italian cookbooks, each of which has a different recipe for bolognese sauce. And sometimes you take, onions, garlic, you take onions, parsley, and carrots, and you chop them up, and you put them in. Sometimes you just use the onions, sometimes the parsley, some people add shallots, some people add garlic. Sometimes people put in white wine, sometimes they put in red wine, sometimes they put olive oil, sometimes they put butter, sometimes they put half olive oil and half butter. Sometimes they use tomatoes, sometimes use tomato paste. You get my point, that there's a lot of permutations to make bolognese sauce, and I've made every one. And it really is important to me to get it right. And if you read the cognitive behavior therapy literature, you very often have kind of a bolognese sauce. There are a number of procedures. We do some teaching, psychoed, we do some thought monitoring, we do some challenging, we do some problem solving, we do some homework assignments, but not every study does the exact same thing. Some people use the red wine, some people use the white wine, and so we sort of have this bolognese sauce problem that we don't really know what the critical components are, but we know that lots of and we use similar components, but we don't know what the same ones are. Yes, a question?
Didn't you just say, though, that exposure was the effective component?
For anxiety. Yeah, for anxiety, exposure turns out to be really effective. So our tomato is really the important element for a bolognese sauce.
Right.
So there's what is the important issue? But we have lots of different components, and so we're not often sure which ones are the most important, which are the ones that we have to do, except exposure for anxiety disorders. We're done with that, and we could go for some others. So we often don't do this. So I'm going to propose another issue. Maybe we have a Dodo effect in cognitive behavior therapy. Can we prove that Beck's cognitive therapy, or Jung's schema-focused cognitive therapy, or social problem-solving therapy is more effective for a number of disorders than some other cognitive behavior therapy? We've done 2 studies here at the Ellis Institute. One where we took an REBT type manual, and another where we followed Beck type manual and medication for depression, and found that they were equally successful. We're just finishing up another one where we have an ACT manual, an REBT manual, and a cognitive therapy manual. And we didn't create the manuals. Steve Hayes created the ACT manual, and Art Friedman created the CT manual, and we're doing that for anxiety disorders. And they're coming out the same. They're coming out the same. So that somehow cognitive behavior therapies may be tapping the same underlying dimension, and we may be doing it in different ways. But I don't know. Maybe there are some common factors in cognitive behavior therapy that other people don't do. So for example, one of the things we do is we set an agenda for the session. One of the things we do is ask people to give us specific stimuli, ask them to go through the ABC analysis of what their beliefs are and what their thoughts are. We do some cognitive restructuring. We do ask them to establish a different response to what they do. Whether or not you change the negative automatic thoughts or the irrational beliefs or the underlying schema or develop new social problem solving skills may be less important than those other common factors. So we may have a common factor problem or Dodo effect problem within cognitive behavior therapy as well. But anyway, so that's kind of the model that we have. So here's one of the things that we have in this research. What the opponents to the primacy of CBT would argue is that the alliance of the researcher is strongly linked to the outcome. In other words, if you run a cognitive therapy CBT intervention and the therapist or the primary researcher is CBT oriented, you're going to have a larger effect size than otherwise. And that the allegiance of the therapist is kind of responsible for the result. So here's sort of a problem with this. The common factors therapies, the Wampold model, sort of says that the type of psychotherapy you do is unimportant. But it's really important that you believe in it. And that the allegiance of the therapist to the model that they're doing accounts for the results. So even if I was trained to be a good psychodynamic therapist, I probably wouldn't get good results because I don't have allegiance to it. And someone who was taught by their agency to be a good cognitive behavior therapist probably wouldn't be so good at it because they don't have the allegiance. Now there is some challenge to that recently that we'll talk about later on, but that's one of the primary conundrums. So the common factors model says what you do really isn't important, but it's really important that you believe in what you do. So that sort of doesn't make sense. So therapists sort of have to believe in the therapy for it to work. And I guess you could see how that would be true, because how could you sell a credible model of treatment if we know that the credibility of an intervention is really necessary to even sell a placebo? If you really didn't believe in it, why? So if you went and you had sort of like tension headaches, or you had gastrointestinal problems, and your GI physician said, take this medication, I'm not so sure it'll work, then maybe you would not have the placebo effects. And so that would be sort of one of the really important issues. So allegiance is a problem. Here's sort of another problem that Wampold notes, and that is that variation in therapy can be attributable as much to the therapist as a person as it can to the therapy. So if we give people, if we run a study and say that there are 3 different treatments, and for each treatment we have 6 different therapies, the degree of variation amongst the therapies will be smaller or equal to the degree of variation in the therapists. So that's kind of an interesting issue. Now, who are the people who have done the research on this? The people who've done the most research on this is Mike Lambert, the people who do the OQ questionnaire down at Utah. People know the Brigham Young OQ questionnaire. It's an individual psychotherapy measure where you give it to clients at the beginning of therapy and each time. And they've been doing this for a long time. They probably have data on 100,000 psychotherapy patients. They have a treatment clinic with about 30 different psychologists at any one time, and they have these clients, and they do a structural equation modeling where they have a regression curve for each patient, how the patient progresses over time. They can bundle those or collapse them across different types of treatments that the person does or around different types of therapists. And when they do it around different types of therapists, what they find is a very large percent of the variance is attributed to the therapist. I didn't know if I really believed this. So we have an article that's revise and resubmit that we did with a dissertation student here, where I took 50 therapists at the Albert Ellis Institute, where everybody was doing the exact same therapy. And we followed their OQs in the same way. We used the OQ instrument. And we got almost exactly the same percentage of variance explained by the person of the therapist. And so this does appear. Pardon?
You replicated.
We replicated it. Well, you know, when this was done at the OQ site, at the Lambert site at BYU, the real issue was that they had, you know, maybe they had, 60 different therapists, but each therapist did a different therapy, so you sort of had a confound of the therapist and the therapy.
But even here, the
But even here, when everyone's doing pretty much the same thing and sitting in the same supervision, you get the same percentage of the variance. And actually, a couple of years back, I put together a symposium which, with some people from BYU, and we called it the MVPs, if you're an athletic fan, and it was the most valuable psychotherapist. And we had 2 other studies besides the BYU study, one from a managed care company that required all the patients that they paid for the treatment to fill this out, and one from the British National Health Service. Now, all those studies sort of confounded therapists with different theoretical orientations, but you get pretty much the same amount of variance explained.
So what was the percentage of variance? What was the percent explained?
It's about 30%. And so if we look around the room, I mean, when you went to graduate school, were there some people that you said, I would never go to them? Right? And don't point to them. And so there are some things that now that we know that there really is this effect of who the person is, and even if you train them to follow the model, there are some things that they do to make the model either work or not work. And so maybe we really don't want to do that. We don't want to just look at that. So I think this is kind of an interesting issue, and Wampold even goes so far as to suggest that outcome therapists, outcome studies, develop a main effect for therapy intervention and a main effect for psychotherapists, so that you get an overall F for the number of different therapists and an overall F for the different treatments, and you look at the degree of variance explained, we look at an eta squared or something like that, to see what's really kind of important. And so this might be really a particular interesting thing. The Lambert people, so I'll share this. The study that we did here with 50 psychotherapists, I never broke the code. In other words, I don't know who the good or bad therapists were. I just know that every therapist was assigned a number, and I've always resisted, because people didn't agree for me to break the code. And some therapists, I hate to say, I know I trained them because I've been here the longest, and some people were like flatliner psychotherapists, their regression curves were really bad, and some people were really effective. And so the OQ people, Lambert's group, is really looking into this, and what they're kind of discovering is no therapist is really bad with everyone, that there's still variability within therapists. They seem to do better with some clients than with others, but that there really are important differences. And a friend of mine who works in that research group says, it's not who people think. If you broke the code, you would say that person, and some people, they think that it's not going to be very obvious. And so what they're looking at is, if we take, there's 2 ways to look at this. Imagine that you're in private practice and the managed care panel that you're on wants to give the OQ to all the patients who come to therapy, and now have this data on your regression equations and want to exclude you from the panel because your patients don't get better compared to most others. I often thought that it would be great for us to do this in graduate school. At our university now, we give the OQ in our training clinic, and we have an average regression equation for people who come to our training clinic, and maybe we ought to bundle by the therapist, by the student, and maybe they should improve their regression equations for each person as they get better. Maybe if they're really bad, we should suggest that they go into social personality psychology, clinical or something like that. That there may be some way to do this. So rather than look at it from a negative, punitive point of view, what they're trying to do is say, let's look at the people that we know are the better therapists within each orientation, and let's watch videos of what they're doing to see if we can identify what they're doing. What are they doing that are important or different, and we can identify the more successful therapists. So I would say that, of the common factors, this kind of makes sense because it's been replicated now with, some large studies. And we probably could learn something as cognitive behavior therapists to be more effective. We had a question.
Well, I just had one question about the design of such studies. It seems like you would have to randomly assign patients to therapists to really get the true sense of their effectiveness overall, because otherwise there's a confound of like, oh, someone's available in the evening, so they get the higher functioning patients that have jobs. Or
Well,
somebody does.
I think the question for the people who may not have heard it for the camera is that you'd have to have random assignment. And I guess that would be true, but these are naturalistic studies, and you're looking at large N's. And so across large N's, at the BYU study and at the National Health Service studies, they do sort of have random assignment. In other words, you just get who's available when you come in. So if you do something like that in a clinic here, maybe the better functioning clients who have jobs are working during the day. But we really don't, they're somewhat random. You're not exactly random. But you're correct. There's always some problems. But again, you have replication and you have very large samples. The Bill Stiles was involved with the British UK National Health Service one. They had a very large N with a measure like the OQ. So this particular part of the common factors model seems to maybe add an important issue. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I might have misunderstood you, but I understood that you said that in the Albert Ellis study with 50 therapists, the therapists did not explain such a big percentage of the variance.
Yes, they did.
30%?
Yeah.
They did?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's a large percent.
Yes.
Okay. So, and this is sort of consistent across studies. So we could say that, I may not believe that all psychotherapies are equal, but I'm starting to be convinced that just training the person in the manual may not be sufficient, and that there may be something to the idea in the common factors approach that there's some characteristics about the person that make you an effective therapist, whether you're doing psychoanalysis or cognitive behavior therapy or Gestalt therapy or emotion-focused therapy, and we don't really know what that is, and it accounts for a pretty large percentage of the variance. Now, the problem is how much of the common variance would we say this is? Wampold would predict that 30% of the variance would be attributed to common elements, 15% or more maybe to the therapist factors, and 15% to the therapy factors. That was his original hypothesis back in 2001, so that you would get different, and that what we don't really do is develop a measure where you have three separate main effects. There's a main effect for common factors, a main effect for therapists, and a main effect for different therapies. This would be a really difficult study to do because you would have very many subjects and conditions.
I just want to clarify what this slide is saying. So he is saying that there could be 15% that is due to the intervention.
Yes, that's right. He would
and
say.
he does allow for that.
He does allow for that. He's not saying that it doesn't matter. He's saying that it's not the most. It's not
the biggest piece.
It's not the biggest piece. It may not be the important piece, and that there are other things. And I think that this is one of the difficulties. Is that I would say that Dave Barlow's probably going to say the same thing. They're going to differ in the percentage, right? No one's going to say that these common factors don't matter, and no one's going to say that the aspect of the therapy doesn't matter. What people are going to disagree about. So back in 2001, he really sort of made this hypothesis. I don't know what will happen in his latest book. So again, the common elements would be an emotionally charged, confiding relationship with a helper, a healing setting with the expectation of professional assistance, a plausible explanation for the symptoms and treatments, some kind of ritual and activities and things that people go through that require the active participation of the therapy and the client. And those would be the common factors. And so the literature does demonstrate some positive correlations between some measures of the relationship. Now let's sort of get into this. When the Division 12 group came out with the idea of empirically supported treatments, the Division 29 came out with a review of the literature on empirically supported relationship variables in psychotherapy. And so if you look for the book, John Norcross is the main editor, and there are chapters. Each chapter is on a different aspect of the Therapeutic Alliance, and they perform meta-analytic reviews to sort of look at what proportion of the outcome in psychotherapy effectiveness is attributed to one of these relationship kind of variables. And the idea was to kind of prove that while there may be evidence for empirically supported treatments, there's equal evidence for relationship variables that are in psychotherapy. So the one that has gained the most attention is the idea of the Therapeutic Alliance. And Therapeutic Alliance, remember, has three aspects. There's the agreement on the goals of therapy, agreement on the tasks of therapy, and the therapeutic bond or the relationship that could be identified in another way. And this has got an interesting phenomenon with it, is because it does predict therapeutic success. The better your therapeutic relationship, the better the outcome at the end. But here's the question. Is the therapeutic relationship a causative factor, or is it a precursor? Do I tend to like my therapist because I'm getting better, or do I like my therapist and then get better? Right? This sort of makes sense. It's because these are correlational studies, it's very hard to sort of figure out whether this is you can't sort of do an experiment where you say, well, you're going to develop a bad relationship with your, and you're going to develop a good relationship, and you develop a bad relationship.
Maybe if you break the codes, you could.
Maybe we could break those codes and give people to the therapists who don't do a good one. So Rob DeRubris sort of looked at this, and he says, patients who are doing well start to feel better, may rate their therapist more positively. So presently, the literature on the Therapeutic Alliance seems to say that, agreement on the goals of therapy is really important, and that will predict what they call an alliance rupture. An agreement on the tasks of therapy, that's kind of important. But that therapeutic bond or relationship may be more of a, early indicator of success, and that the further it is from the beginning of therapy, or the closer it is to the end of therapy, the greater the relationship with outcome. So if you take a Therapeutic Alliance relationship measure towards the end of therapy, it's going to correlate more with the effectiveness than if you have it very early. So it may not be so positive. It may be that you develop this positive relationship because you're getting better, or it sort of kills it right from the very beginning. Okay, so we looked at chain after this point. Okay, so that's really what I want to talk about. What I've mentioned is that there is this issue of when the correlations occur here. Okay, so these kinds of issues have been replicated a couple times, and so we really don't may say that the relationship works another way. Okay, so here's sort of the other common factors approach that Wampold will say, when we compare cognitive behavior therapy against other bona fide therapies, we don't get a big success. Well, what therapy is cognitive behavior therapy compared to the most? Behavior therapy. I mean, see again, you may not have recognized this, but years ago, in the 1980s, there were lots of people that said cognition is an epiphenomenon, don't pay attention to it. And it's really the relaxation and exposure that works. It's really the behavioral activation that works. It's really the behavioral interventions that works. And so most of the studies that would compare cognitive behavior therapy to a bona fide treatment are going to be behavior therapy studies. And so you're going to have very little difference. So there really is this debate of whether or not we really have a whole group of studies that compare CBT or BT together to a bona fide psychotherapy. And so remember, the APA statement is that all psychotherapies are equally successful, but those psychotherapies are sort of bona fide psychotherapies. It's not like anything you decide to do. There's got to be like a literature on it, it's got to share those common factors, and you have to have some training in it and stuff like that. And it's really hard to do studies of two active treatment components. Now, one of the reasons it's very hard is if we assume that the other psychotherapy is going to have some effect, and you're comparing two active treatments, the differences will be smaller. You will need a larger N to develop a significant effect size or a significant difference. And what are the ends of most psychotherapy studies? How long does it take to develop a significant number of subjects that are going to take CBT for social phobia versus psychodynamic therapy for social phobia? And assuming that they both have some positive effect, you need a larger N to be able to detect that. You need a smaller N to detect a weaker effects placebo-controlled condition, and so that may not be it. And so I think until pretty recently, there weren't a whole lot of studies comparing CBT to other active interventions. And in preparing for this talk, I actually had to go do a literature search and sort of pay attention to some things that came in on listservs and other things. And recently, there have been a number of them that have come out, and that they have shown that, there's one recent study that shows that CBT versus psychoanalysis is more effective for social phobia. There have been two studies with eating disorders, and the two studies with eating disorders have really received a lot of attention. And the reason they received a lot of attention is because the people who started the therapy were aligned with psychodynamic therapy. They believed in psychodynamic therapy. They did these studies, and they found that CBT worked in 20 weeks. The psychoanalysis did have some effect, but it took 2 years. I don't know, if you had any eating problem, would you want to go for 2 years, or would you want to go for 20 weeks? So I think that the 20 weeks wins. And so there was another study in eating disorders that's been reported recently. And so I think we're really starting to get some additional studies to show that we have a superiority in these interventions. Now, why don't we see more of these studies? Why don't we see more real comparative studies? Some people would say, well, is it worth the horse race? Why do we really want to know whether or not one form of therapy works better than the other? Are we going to convince anybody anyway? Right? Do we just automatically know that, we believe that one works? And also, I don't think anybody believes that the time limit for a CBT study would be effective with psychoanalysis. I mean, nobody develops a 2-year protocol for eating disorders in CBT. I mean, you may have some clients that stay in therapy that long. But the psychoanalyst really sort of required a longer study. So I think that may be one of the reasons that they're really hard, they're really expensive to do. You would have to have therapists who are trained in both modalities. So I think I said we are doing one, we're almost done with this one on anxiety disorder where we did ACT, CT, and REBT. And it really was a difficult thing to put together because we had to have, different people agree on the therapy manuals, different people agree on mechanisms of change. We had to have, train all the therapists and try to equate them for allegiance and all that. It was rather an expensive endeavor to do that. And it's probably harder, so that this idea to really test the Dodo bird effect may become really an expensive thing for us to do. So that's one of the issues. The other issue is to do meta-analysis. And here's one of the things that happens. The common factors people often say that if you do a meta-analysis, the effect sizes come out pretty equal, and that the cognitive behavior therapy studies only do better on measures of symptoms and not other measures. And I always say, well, aren't you supposed to do better on measures of symptoms? So if you've ever done a meta-analysis, one of the things that happens if you go back to older studies, if you did a study on anxiety, people had a measure of anxiety. You had 2 measures of anxiety. Today, you give the people the whole MMPI or the PAI, and you give them a whole number of questionnaires. And then you put all the questionnaires in. So if you're developing a treatment that's targeted at depression, and you have an MMPI scale for somatic complaints, maybe that's not going to change so much. But if you aggregate across all the dependent measures, well, that's going to bring down the average effect size of the targeted variable. And so the common factors approach almost sort of says that, well, CBT is great, but you're only doing better on the targeted symptoms, or measures of the targeted symptoms, and not the measures of the other measures that may be included in the study. And I would say, well, that's exactly what you would expect, a differential effect. Yes, sir?
I'm not sure it's about the symptoms. The argument of, I think the name is Drew Weston, is that people come to the clinic not with circumscribed profile of symptoms or DSM disorders, but rather in a polysymptomatic picture. And so those studies that study a specific disorder have some disadvantage in ecological validity.
So let's just say that for the camera, I think, and you have a very good point, is that many people come for therapy with polysymptoms. They have a lot of different symptoms. They have a general malade. Depression and anxiety correlate very highly, and if you just target a symptomatic measure, you may have ecological invalidity because you're not measuring all the things that may be influential that the person you may want to help the person with. So you may not have a positive well-being improvement and those kinds of things, and that may be a reasonable criticism. That but that is one of the debates in the field. That some people, like the Rubrics, would say, yes, you want to target the symptoms, and other people would say that, you know, that is ecological invalidity, that you are not sort of recognizing all the different things that people have. And I guess you would also want people to have a better quality of life when they ended therapy. Right?
So that's not just symptoms,
that's right, you would want them to have a better quality of life, but you would be hard to have a better quality of life if you had a lot of symptoms. And so, you know, that is one of the debate. What's the nature? And if you go back to the issue of the Dodo bird hypothesis, that issue of what is the outcome measure has been around for about 40 years. Some people would say you want to target specific symptoms, and the more you follow the medical model, the more you would. So if you're treating OCD, you'd want to have a Y-box measure. And if you were interested in an overall quality, maybe you want the OQ, which is a better quality. Maybe you'd want to show that some life satisfaction improves. Maybe you'd want to see that the person not only has lesser symptoms, but they have better social interactions. And that has been one of the critical debates. And what is the outcome measure? Behavior therapists have always tend to focus more on the symptom measures, and our common factors colleagues have always sort of focused on more general functioning measures. And I think that debate still continues, although I would think that we could get some change in symptoms would reflect the general function measures first. Okay, so this is a very definite issue. We talked about the eating disorder studies, and the interesting thing about the eating disorder studies is that the discussion of the study was like, yes, CBT got the people better in 20 weeks, and psychoanalysis got the people some improvement in 2 years. How can we make psychoanalysis more effective? Why? If you already have something that makes them more effective after 20 weeks, why would you sort of do that? So I think that it's not so easy for people to give up their theoretical orientation. So this is this issue of non-targeted symptoms that we just talked about that's on the PowerPoint. So is the positive outcome that we see in therapy due to the fact that investigators are really invested in the approach? This goes into the allegiance issue, and this sort of takes a little bit of discussion. Because one of the things that, I know Mark Reinecke. Mark Reinecke was out here a couple years ago. We did a colloquium talk at St. John's, and he had some really interesting data on cognitive behavior therapy of depression meta-analysis. And one of the things that he showed was that early studies had larger effect sizes than more recent studies, and that the effect size of an outcome study sort of diminished across time. And that this appears to have been a finding that other people have found. That in the beginning of a new therapy, people are excited about it, and could there be an experiment or bias effect that you expect larger outcomes and you get them?
Has anyone linked that to the decline effect across the sciences?
The question is, has anybody linked it to the decline effect across sciences?
There's a documented effect throughout the sciences, including physical sciences, that over time replicable results just sort of diminish in a way that we can't really account for yet.
So this is, what he's referring to is that there's a big issue that has been appearing in the journal Psychological Science that is true of all psychology, maybe all sciences.
Physics, biology.
Yeah, that replication is one of the hallmarks of science, and replication seems to be harder to do, and that as time goes by, you're less likely to replicate previous findings. And APS has kind of has this replication project suggesting that it's a good idea for master's theses and other research projects that students have to do towards their degrees to do replication studies, because we have this crisis of things being unreplicated. And so Mark Reinecke's finding that we get decreased effect sizes could be this idea that it's difficult to replicate things. And the argument sort of in the APS journals sort of goes something like this: is a real big effect size may be somewhat random, and that when you find it, you're all excited and you publish it, but making many samples of the same study sort of is eventually going to average out to a lower effect size as time goes by. So there is this problem in cognitive behavior therapy that we have a result. And some people take this as really a negative thing, and some people have said, we've been doing good psychotherapy research for 40 years and we don't have an increased effect size. So all this research, are we really getting, more effective therapy with all this, and we may not. So this does sort of create a problem, and the allegiance issue does sort of create a problem, that maybe we have an experiment or bias effect. On the other hand, how do you eliminate an experiment, the allegiance effect? Because you have to ask somebody to spend their time and their money doing therapy on therapy that they didn't believe in. No, I wouldn't do that. Would you do that? Maybe they'd have to pay me a whole lot of money to sort of spend my time doing research to validate something that I didn't believe in, Why? So there is this debate about allegiance, and many of the people in the common factors approach will just say every one of those studies that are supporting a CBT therapy that's effective has an allegiance phenomenon going on there, and that really should be discredited and sort of remove that. Whereas other people say, why would you bother studying something you didn't believe in? But we do have this problem across science, biology, physics, chemistry, definitely in psychology, and if you look in psychological science, you can see this, that replication is not so easy. And replication is, the definitions of science that we teach in elementary schools. One of the things about science is that it's replicable, and it's not always replicable. So, yes?
You're talking about doing pure technique with these therapies. But in practice, how many people do? A lot of people don't CBT people
Right.
work in psychodynamic ideas and vice versa.
So what she's saying is that the idea is that people don't always do pure technique. And I think that you have, that's another sort of criticism that people will make, is that, how hard is it to follow a treatment manual? Now, and how flexible are the treatment manuals? If you listen to Phil Kendall talk, he talks about following a treatment manual in a very flexible way. Other people suggest that maybe they're not so flexible. And the view amongst the non-CBT people is that we are a pretty rigid OCD group of therapists. They're going to make people fill out forms and follow things, without any agreement on the goals and tasks, and we're pretty rigid. So I think you make a very good point. I don't think people do that, but I think that's the view that many people have of the CBT field, and that I really didn't know that until I hung out with them. That they don't view us as a very flexible group. They tend to view us as a very sort of rigid group that just sort of follows this treatment manual, and we probably are a lot more flexible than people think. And so one of the issues that I think you bring up is that it's hard to follow a treatment manual, and that a lot of the relationship variables that go on in psychotherapy, we do teach. And Jacques Barber, I don't know if everyone knows Jacques Barber from Adelphi. I live around the corner from Adelphi, although I don't go there much, but I have lunch with Jacques every once in a while. And Jacques has a theory about CBT and relationship variables, and he says that the original CBT people like Ellis and Beck were trained in psychoanalysis, and that they were very attentive to psychotherapeutic process and relationship variables. And so they were pretty good at it. And if, I ran a group with Al for a number of years, and he was really kind of an iconoclast when you put him on stage, but in therapy he was really very sensitive and behaved very differently to clients depending on their moods and problems, and very reactive. I remember back in the 70s watching Tim Beck do therapy, and he was really sort of a master. He would sort of do a cognitive intervention, but it was kind of seamless, and it was so effortless. The client just sort of like glided through it. It was just really beautiful to watch. And so Barber says that, they were trained in that. The second generation of CBT people, so older people like myself and Art Friedman, watched them, and we learned it. The third generation just reads it in books and learns it from people who didn't see that, and maybe they don't have such good relationship skills. That's sort of one. That's the perception of people. That may be true. That may be true. But clearly, we don't write about the relationship skills as much in our treatment manuals and in our books as the psychoanalysts and the Rogerians and other kind of people. So maybe we had better pay more attention to that in the way we write things. So I think Arlene has a very good point there. Okay, so can we get better studies that compare CBT treatments and psychodynamic treatments and others? And I think we can. So what is the solution to all this problem? Dave Barlow has a solution, and I kind of like Dave Barlow's solution. Dave Barlow says, we really want to sort of stop the psychotherapy wars. We sort of want to stop viewing this as kind of an either-or thing. And we should consider the schools of psychotherapy dead, okay? And that we really want to replace empirically supported treatments with empirically based principles. So to get back to your issue about what a clinician would do, you would realize that you need to develop behavioral activation or exposure or better assertiveness training skills, and you would have a principle, and you might apply that principle somewhat uniquely, but you're following the principle. So rather than follow a manual, we go to empirically based principles, and we can have probably fewer principles that we would be able to build upon in these in an individual case than give up a manual. And as I sort of started off saying, I think the manuals are killing us. I think the manuals make us look silly to the rest of the psychotherapy world because there's too many of them. You know, nobody can remember them all. But if we condense them to some basic principles that the therapist can apply, I think Dave really has the heart of clinical practice there that we really want to follow that. So, and Dave says you're always going to have this allegiance in therapy, but that's not the reason why treatments work. He says allegiance. And there have been a couple of studies that have come out recently, which we can go into, that have really shown that training the therapist into some good skills really accounts for success regardless of their allegiance. So this is sort of like some very new kind of research on that. Here's sort of, when I say Dave Barlow's reply is coming, I had this conversation with Dave once where I kind of tried to convince him that ABCT should focus all its issues and debate on the Dodo effect, because that's what the rest of the psychotherapy world believes. And you know, we keep churning out these CBT studies versus with this disorder and that disorder versus, you know, with these uncontrolled conditions, but this is really where the action is, okay? Most of the research is CBT, and I think that we as a profession or as a school of thought, whatever, probably have forced the other schools of psychotherapy to put up and do more outcome studies, because I don't think it was in their tradition to do it. So we do have the number of studies. And so the issue is, do more studies really make it more likely that it's valid? And if we buy the replication principle that is the problem in science, probably the more studies you have, it's better because it is harder to replicate. And that's why more studies may be better. More studies may be done that are not reported, which is why that you need to report that you started a study. So here's sort of a problem. I don't know if people sort of recognize this, but when you start a psychotherapy study, certain journals require that you log it in the Corcoran review website, so that if the study doesn't work and you don't publish it because it didn't work, some meta-analytic reviewer or reviewer can go back and say, well, there were 10 studies of therapy X that were started that were never published and didn't have positive effects. The problem with more studies is we don't know. Well, maybe there were as many psychodynamic studies. Maybe there were more CBT studies, but they didn't work. And unless we have a way to control who starts a study to know that it exists, we really don't have what they call a file drawer problem in meta-analysis. There's all these studies that don't work and that they don't make it into the reviews of the literature. So back around 2005, 2006, when behavior therapy was listed to be abstracted in Medline, we had to agree that people who would publish in that journal would sort of start an outcome study by mentioning it in these web studies, so that websites like Cochrane's, so that people can tell. So this really becomes a real difficult problem because we don't know about the replication issue, because journals tend to publish positive results. and we don't know about all the failures to replicate, and failures to replicate may be more important. So we do produce more studies, and that may be a good thing. Now, here's one of the things that Dave would argue. When you partial out the variance that dues to aspects of the different percentages explained, you know, like how much is due to common factors, how much is due to the therapist, how much is due to the therapy, probably some disorders have a very large effect of a placebo. In other words, let's just say panic disorder. Maybe panic disorder is pretty easy to treat. In panic disorder, if you look at the pre to post test scores for the placebo treatment and the pre to post test scores for the active treatment, you have a pretty large percentage or D statistic for the placebo. Those disorders are probably going to be more responsive to common factors. But that disorders that have a very low effect or a zero effect of the placebo are not going to be responsive to common factors. So here's what Barlow would say. Have you ever seen someone with OCD respond to common factors? Do they respond well? So someone with a general malade, you know, sort of like a general, I don't know, anxiety or subclinical level of anxiety, they might do really well, have a significant percentage of the variance respond to the placebo intervention. And so that disorder is probably going to respond more to common factors. How about trichotillomania? You know, do they respond well? You know, how about encapresis, the one that got me in trouble in this very beginning when I started looking at comparisons of treatments? They don't get better as a result of placebo interventions, and that for those disorders, so Barlow's solution is, what we're probably going to find is that the percentage of the variance that's due to common factors, therapy factors, and interventions may vary depending on the type of clinical problem. The more the clinical problem responds to placebo interventions, the more the variance in it may be responsive to common factors, and the less variance may be responsive to the treatment. The less it responds to placebo, the less it's going to have common factors explain the variance, and the more intervention is going to be accounted for by the specific treatment. So I think that kind of really makes sense as a way to resolve this. So common factors are probably not going to not account for much variance in OCD, but they may account for a lot of variance in panic disorder. That's Dave's example, and he's got an article coming out in Psychotherapy where he's going to talk about this. Now, here's sort of another question about all this. I don't know, how many people here deal with working with children? Do you find that common factors research has just ignored children? It's like, you know, this common factor stuff just really doesn't respond to children. I don't think that the common factors is going to work for conduct disorder kids at all, or ADHD, or oppositional defiance disorder kids. You know, it really is not working there at all, and that this whole literature sort of is out. It really sort of focusing on adults, and it tends to focus on adults with maybe not so serious diagnostic or difficult conditions. So I have not yet seen a good review of common factors on child therapy at all.
Just to clarify, the research on the common factors, it's just those two big meta-analyses? Or is there a whole body of research on psychodynamic?
There's a whole body of research, and if you go to the Norcross book, you will see sort of a review on the Therapeutic Alliance and on empathy.
So are they comparing all psychodynamic therapy types?
They sort of say cuts across therapies.
So they include CBT
And for example, so when they will do this, they will say, is there a mediator for the type of therapy? So there have been some reviews of the literature. One of the latest reviews of the literature, the Norcross book, was So it was up, the reviews in the Norcross book were updated in a special issue of the journal Psychotherapy. And one of them say, like, for example, does empathy, an important variable? Yes, empathy does predict change. It's a common factor, but there's no interaction. It's not more effective for psychodynamic therapy than it is for cognitive behavior therapy, so that they will review it that way. And you know, I think if you look at some other psychotherapy journals besides behavior therapy and the journals that CBT people use, a lot of the research is process-oriented. It's sort of looking at what kind of variables change as outcome variable change across time and not RCTs. So I think that if you were a member of Division 17, the Division of Counseling and Psychology, you would probably grow up in a world where people did process-oriented therapy on these kinds of common factors. That's probably what you do your dissertation is. That's probably what your professors would be doing. And we don't really talk to those people that much in CBT and ABCT. But there's a very big literature on that, and so that there is a substantial literature to sort of do those.
There is research in non-CBT trials.
Yes.
So we don't write it.
Well, I think we do. I mean, I think it comes out. Randomized clinical trials, I think, you know, they make the, you know, archives of general psychiatry and sort of posted on the ABCT listserv on those things come out, but they're out there. So I think that Barlow sort of has this idea that we're really going to have an interaction of, you know, type of problem or type of diagnosis versus the degree, which is going to differentiate how much common factors, how much the therapist factors. I think he would also say is, and this is what I believe, I think I'm a better therapist for paying attention to my friends in Division 29. I think that I've been a little bit more, I've learned a lot about therapeutic relationships and therapeutic styles. I probably, you know, give homework assignments a little bit differently, and I probably maybe suggest alternative beliefs differently as a result of listening to them, and that we could learn to do this. So there's a very interesting study done by Castengay where he took a manual for Beck's cognitive therapy, and he trained therapists in it. And then he took another group of therapists and he trained them in the Beck's cognitive therapy manual and paying attention to the Therapeutic Alliance. And then randomly assigned clients to, you know, the cognitive therapy group or the cognitive therapy and Therapeutic Alliance training group. And, you know, you get this improvement when you pay attention to both sets of variables. So probably we could benefit a lot, and I don't think any of us would deny that. I think that our literature hasn't attended to that so much. So let me give you another observation that I have. You know, I didn't notice this, but when I do supervision here at the Ellis Institute, I probably bring up countertransference issues more than I was ever aware of, or maybe I'm doing it more, because I find that if you're doing an active directive cognitive behavior therapy, and a client has a schema that I need other people to validate my worth, and you have that schema, you're going to have a hard time challenging that schema in your client because it feels uncomfortable and you want to agree with your client. And so I would propose that the more active you are in challenging people's deeper beliefs, the more it's going to interfere. If you're passive and you don't have to challenge it, then, you know, it's easy for you to not be uncomfortable because you don't have to talk about it so directly. So I think Barlow would argue that we might want to have a cumulative set of principles, and those set of principles may be mechanisms of change, such as assertiveness training and practice. They may be exposure. They may be developing agreement on the goals and tasks of therapy. They may be, you know, some other relationship variables, and that we really may need to do that. I would go a step further, and I would say, if we really want to convince people that CBT is better, we would really want to do the type of study that Castengay did. We would want to say, we're going to train therapists in doing, you know, this form of therapy with these common factors, versus CBT with the common factors and show that the CBT plus the training in the common factors is better. Because unless we sort of really test the hypothesis, you know, that the other people believe in, then why should they believe in what we believe in? We have run out and tried to show that something is better than a no treatment control condition and not better than what other people are doing. And, you know, the best model for this is an old model, and that is Tim Beck. Tim Beck did the hardest study on his first study for cognitive therapy of depression. He didn't say, I'm going to show that cognitive therapy is better than a waiting list control, or that it's better than a, you know, placebo psychotherapy. He said the most effective treatment at the time was tricyclic medication. Can I show I'm better than tricyclic medication? Which is a very brave thing to do and probably got him a lot of traction. So he could say to his psychiatric colleagues, I can do better than what you did. And I can compare, I can actually test my treatment to what you think is a treatment. If the rest of the psychotherapy world is saying these common factors really work, they're not going to listen to CBT is better if we compare CBT to a no treatment control or a waiting list or a placebo. They're going to compare it to what they think is effective. And if we don't do that, we're really not advancing science. We're really just doing these other studies. If you're going to really advance science, you have to really test two hypotheses. And one will be right and one will be wrong. And what we've done is I think we've created studies that allow us to support a therapy, but not falsify or show that one is better than the other, one is better. And so therefore, we haven't done good. Now, I think these are going to be very hard studies for us to do. I think they're going to be very expensive because we're going to have active components, and that we may have to sort of learn how to measure the common factors, and we may have to consider them. But I think that paying attention to the things like what the therapists do, that I'm kind of convinced that there's really a wide variation. And I would bet that anybody here that's on a faculty some way, know you have some graduate students that you think are knowledgeable, they get all A's, but you're really scared about what they're going to do to people. You're really worried about them. And you know that. And I have to tell you, in my experience as an administrator in a department, the worst nightmare is you have somebody in the practicum or externship says, this person is really bad with clients and they really should not move forward, and you look at their grades and they're all terrific. They got all A's. What do I do with that? And we're not measuring people. And if we would go back to the kind of stuff that the OQ group is doing in Utah, we may say these are the skills that people do. So I would have one observation. I remember years ago learning from Arnie Lazarus that he would do supervision with an audio tape, or videotapes around it, and he would stop the tape when he heard the emotion in the client's voice and say, did you hear that? And that inflection in the voice says that that's the hot topic, and that's the skill that you gotta learn, and maybe we need to pay attention to more of those micro skills. I don't think that invalidates that we're going to do exposure, but what we're going to expose people to, we're going to find out from some of these micro therapist skills. Yes, sir.
So this is one sort of like funny thing I find about this whole discussion. People do things. There's lots of things people do. They build buildings, they design buildings, they play guitars, they make bolognese sauce. As far as I'm aware, psychotherapy is the only human endeavor where it is surprising to discover that how well someone can do something relates to how well it gets done. I mean, what we're talking about is if you measure like a variation in how well cognitive behavior therapists can do cognitive behavior therapy, it will significantly relate to the outcome.
Yes.
That's like, that should really be evident. And that certain things, like in medicine, like how well someone can be a physician will relate to patient outcomes. And there's certain skills and certain ideas.
Especially in surgery.
Well, that's so then surgery should work for a headache, and like aspirin should work for indigestion. So the idea that there are specific tasks that are related to one another, like a class of behavior, that these specific tasks will result in different outcomes for specific problems, and that how well someone can do, like a class of tasks, is also worth study. I think that's what is really coming across in your talk, and it's really important.
And I would say that two things, how well you do the thing, is that there are probably two levels. There are some micro-level skills, and there's this whole area in counseling psychology called micro skills, where you learn the micro skills. And what we do in CBT is we kind of write our treatment manuals assuming that people have these micro-counseling skills. And maybe we don't teach them well enough. So I always have this fantasy that if you're going to accept people into a clinical counseling or school psychology program, you should give people the GREs and have sort of a minimum score, and then you ought to have a measure of how well they can detect emotions in the facial expressions or vocabulary or the paralinguistic elements, and that ought to be one of the entrance requirements, because I think that's maybe very hard to teach. We haven't really got good measures of that. Ekman has some measures of that, and we really haven't tried to sort of like, can we teach these people this and show an improvement in this clinical skills? And I think that's the kind of thing that the common factors people are doing. Now, I'm not going to say that that's unimportant. That may account for a certain percentage of the variance of how well you do cognitive behavior therapy and how well you get the person to do a behavioral activation assignment. But we usually keep them separate. And that maybe that's what we would do. In other words, if we follow Barlow's idea, we would have a group of behavioral principles. Some of those principles might be at a more macro level, like exposure. And some of them might be at a more micro level, such as identifying the emotion or the feared stimulus by listening to the way the person sounds or the look on their face, so we identify the real key component. But we don't always put them together, and I think that cognitive behavior therapists may be more macro, and the other people may be more micro, and we may agree more than we think.
I like the idea of Barlow with empirically supported principles. Is there any place where there is a list of those principles?
Is there anywhere there's a list of those principles?
Yes, a written list.
I don't know, maybe that's, but I think that that's really what maybe you ought to write to him. I will write to him because, he knew I was doing this talk and he sent me some stuff. And so I'm going to write back to him and say, everybody wants to know where the list of principles are. But I think that's really the issue. And I think that's one of the issues that we haven't talked about. Maybe rather than, when we have this Division 12 empirically supported treatments, we really want to have empirically supported principles, and that's one of the things that we're talking about with Dean McKay and are talking about putting into place. We ought to sort of list the principle, because the principle may be more important than the specific treatment
And
manual.
then the empirically supported micro skills.
And the empirically supported micro skills. Yes, sir.
There was an attempt to do that by Castanguy and Butler. It's a book called Therapy Change Mechanisms That Work.
Okay.
And it's very complicated. If you look at like 52 mechanisms, for treating depression. But they did try to do this. It was a very admirable project. Maybe 2005, 2006.
Okay. So that may be one of the things we want to do.
What's the thing?
One of the things that I...
Change mechanisms that work.
Yeah, Butler. So look at my... One of the things that Dave has gone is to look at these transdiagnostic protocols. And the transdiagnostic protocols say, let's develop a protocol with some principles that'll work for anxiety disorders or eating disorders rather than a separate CBT treatment for, bulimia, and another one for anorexia, and another one for binge eating. And let's sort of talk about some general principles that apply, because, very often people do have comorbidities. And, the other argument that people have against RCTs, I think a lot of the arguments that clinicians have against RCTs are really valid. And the argument that they have is, well, I don't see clients with one disorder. Anybody see clients with one disorder? There was a study that Tim Beck did once, where he looked at the cognitions that were uniquely attributed to depression and the cognitions that were uniquely attributed to anxiety. And I remember him saying, these cognitions really are related to anxiety, not depression. And these cognitions are related to depression. But we had to go through so many patients to find the people who just had depression and just had anxiety and didn't have the other one, that it's not so clinically useful, because most people have both. And it was so hard to get these separate groups together. And so, the transdiagnostic thing is an attempt. So I think what we're trying to do is sort of get these principles and transdiagnostic manuals that are kind of like factor analyses. Or factor analysis on SPSS is called a data reduction. It's like we're trying to reduce things into sort of a handleable number of issues. And I think that's kind of the issue. At St. John's, where I teach, we started to have these, buy copies of every one of those treatment manuals that I had, and we put them in our training clinic. And students are overwhelmed. Every time they have a case, they got to go find the treatment manual and learn it. They can't learn it, so we got to sort of do some principles. And so maybe we really sort of say, are all psychotherapies effective? Well, one of the things that we haven't done is the two things here. I know the people who were the big advocates for the resolution on psychotherapy works in APA. And so I had this conversation with them, and I said, so you had this conversation that these are the things, and all the things that are in that resolution, they got everybody to buy into. And I say, well, what are the things that we didn't have consensus on? And the APA Commission didn't publish that. And they said, oh, well, there's lots of things we don't have consensus on. And I'm sort of encouraging the people in Division 29 who were responsible for writing the statement that ended up in the APA resolution to sort of say, after reviewing the evidence, these are what we don't have consensus on. Because the things we don't have consensus on are the things we really need to research, not necessarily the things we have consensus on. And the Wampold people say, something's got to be a bona fide psychotherapy. So if you got a group of adherents, does that mean that you have a bona fide psychotherapy? Are there any things that really don't work? And what doesn't work? So that's really kind of what we have to do. And so the other interesting issue is, do we have a special category in empirically supported principles if you show that the theoretical principle that you think something works on works? And I'm probably always going to make enemies if you do this. The perfect example for this is EMDR. EMDR works. And it works because it's got lots of activities that are endemic to lots of other forms of cognitive behavior therapy, whether or not the crucial component that Francis thinks is the critical component may not be the critical component. And if you show that this therapy works for the theoretical reason that it's supposed to, maybe that gives you a special spot of heaven in empirically supported principles, that you've really shown that there's an empirical principle that backs up, and that's better than this. So we really don't have a big literature on psychotherapies or interventions that don't work. Can anybody name an intervention on therapies that you want to avoid, that have been shown not to work, that are considered disreputable? There are two such references. One is John Norcross did a survey of, sort of when he does these Delphi polls, and he did a Delphi poll of asking people which therapies he thought were discredited, and that's sort of published out there. And Scott Lilienfeld from Emory has an article on things that have been shown not to work. And we really don't spend so much time talking about what not to do. It's almost like anything goes. We haven't really learned what hasn't gone. And I think that that is another sort of problem with the way we approach this, is that we have these theoretical allegiances. So I'm going to suggest that, sort of in closing, that the dodo bird is extinct, that it's going to be hard for people to give up their therapeutic allegiances. In behavior therapy, you know, after you read the ABCT listserv, we don't really trust each other. People say, you know, can you give me the name of an ACT therapist in Portland? We don't ask for a generic CBT person. Is there a cognitive therapist in Bangor, Maine that you can refer to? We don't trust other CBT therapists because we want somebody who just sort of does our type of CBT. And I think it's really hard for people to give up those allegiances. But I think that prevents us from growing as a field. I think that we really need to have some basic principles, and that the allegiance to small tribes has been a problem. The science will only progress when we have greater principles, and that's really what we want to do, and that maybe some principles will be more successful than others. I think that we'll find that to be true, but I think that in looking at this debate of the common factors do suggest some things that we might want to pay attention to. I do kind of think that, you know, that a therapy for anxiety disorders, no matter how many common factors you put in there without exposure, I'm not going to put much faith in, but paying attention to some of the common factors may augment the success of that, and so those principles will be put into. And I also think that we as a field are doing studies to play to ourselves and not to the overall community, and that if we really want to have an impact on the rest of the psychotherapists, we really want to do studies that are going to really go nose to nose with another bona fide psychotherapy and the common factors, and to be able to show this intervention that included these things explained so much variance better than the other psychotherapy, and does better than the common factors alone, or does better than another therapy with measuring the common factors, because that's what the other people believe, and we are ignoring the real scientific debate. Okay? And I think eventually we'll probably give up the psychotherapy as religion model, where we all go to worship at other places. And maybe eventually we'll develop the trans-theoretical model that Prochaska and Di Clementi, and we'll find, you know, if you go back to Prochaska and Di Clementi, they really talked about things that cut across theories, and that's really maybe where we want to go. Okay? All right, I want to thank you for doing this. And any questions? Any debates? Any disagreements? Some disagreements. Yes?
Thank you, that was marvelous. I wanted to ask your opinion now that you see medicine, psychiatry, everyone is moving, or there's an attempt to move to individualized medicine. And I wonder if this is something we can do more within psychotherapy. The idea is, I know about the eclectic model. If I think of myself as a clinician for the last 25 years, I would not be good at it. You know, I was psychodynamic for that many years and did my best, and now I'm a CBT therapist and I'm doing my best. I don't think I can learn everything, but I noticed that if I'm able to capture what's good for the patient, and that's a whole sentence we can, you know, talk about, then maybe I can refer him. Let's say I'm right now doing CBT, and it's, I think what you asked earlier, it's not that CBT is not good, but we all know as good clinicians that sometimes some of our interventions will not work with a specific person. And maybe if at a certain point, most of our interventions might not work for this person, he may need to be referred to a more psychodynamic approach.
So the issue is, can we identify what our interventions and what us as a therapist is going to be more successful at, and when we know that someone is not, can we refer them out?
And it's something maybe, I'm sorry, just one more thing. Maybe there are certain dimensions within the patient. I mean, we all, hopefully, at the end of the day, want to focus on the patient and help the patient. Not that we don't have to think about our own techniques. But I think that people that you mentioned that do very well in their own skin, meaning the theory they learned, and they actually are more free to tap into what the patient needs. And then they change up to a point because our theories, our knowledge, our experience does, go up to a point, does block us. But there may be, what I actually want to say, maybe the research also has to go to that direction. Maybe the...
Well, I think in terms of, I think there's a really good change in the research mentality. And I want to give a lot of credit to Marv Goldfried. I don't know if anyone knows Marv Goldfried. And one of the things that Marv has done is he's taken areas where there's been strong support for CBT, and he's asked clinicians to sort of fill out questionnaires about where the intervention breaks down so that future research can be guided by what the clinicians are finding difficult doing in using CBT with a specific disorder. So if you track down Marv, and he's done one for, I think, panic, one for social phobia, he's got a couple others up and going. And so Marv has been the only person I know of to date that has really figured out a mechanism to get feedback from clinicians on what is not working in the procedure, and then can turn around and include that. So I think this is a really big change in CBT, which will make it more clinician-friendly. The other thing that I would argue is that science may help us with this issue about knowing that people don't get better in what they do. And I would go back to the OQ group, the Mike Lambert group. The OQ, this outcomes questionnaire, they've given it to hundreds of thousands of psychotherapy patients, and what they know is that the best predictor of how much people change is the initial level. So you get a score, and as you go up on the score, they can say, okay, we have 30,000 people that had this intake score, let's follow them over the 25 sessions, let's make a regression equation, we have a confidence interval, 1 standard deviation above and beyond, and so we have this norm to compare of people who've been in psychotherapy that started at this outcome questionnaire. And so what they've done is that they've done research where they followed people and they say, what are the patients that have not shown as much success as the average person at that intake score? And then let's explore why. And that they have found that there's 3 primary reasons why people fail in psychotherapy. And their failure is very scientifically devised. As you're consistently more than one standard deviation above the confidence interval for the mean regression for patients at your intake score. And there's 3 of them. One is you have a poor therapeutic alliance. You don't have agreement on the goals or tasks, and somehow you don't like each other. Another is you have no desire, low motivation for change. And the other is you have a serious mental illness that the clinician misdiagnosed. And so they have like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or something like that. So I think that people are starting to do that, but that's kind of research that counseling psychologists do that's more process over time. It's not an RCT thing. And it's really very effective. And we use that kind of very commonly here. And it's very helpful to sort of look at this. And I think a lot of the people don't have agreement on the goals. They don't want to do the kind of therapy that we want them to do. And it's really clear that it's agreement on the tasks of therapy that they think they're going to get better some other way. And we could sort of give them psychoeducation, or maybe we refer them to someone who is going to give them the kind of intervention that they feel comfortable with, because that's one of the things that we would find. One more question. Yes, sir.
Like you, I'm an unusual cognitive behavior therapist because I have made a study of this area, and it also has made me, I think, a much better clinician. I've come to a lot of the same conclusions. But one thing I think should be noted is that if you look at these meta-analyses, including probably the most prominent by Bruce Wampold, he does make the point that he's found treatment by problem interactions. The most prominent being treatment of phobic disorders with exposure. And I think that's, and then he goes on, however, to make the general conclusion that there's no difference in treatment.
Well, he didn't find no difference in treatment.
Yeah. But I think it's really important to emphasize that point, because there are a lot of people out there with phobic anxiety, including OCD, the point that you made, who are not getting the right treatment, and yet these studies are not emphasizing that conclusion. And I
Yes.
think we're really doing a disservice to the clinical population.
I think that cognitive behavior therapists may be doing a disservice by not trying to do the studies that are going to convince the people who are going to deliver the service.
Yeah,
Violet?
Thanks, that was a great talk. Just wanted to add to the idea of sort of the common principles, that one of the things that also could be happening with these therapies is that we're beginning to identify common mechanisms of change. So, for example, traditionally, the common mechanism for change for exposure therapy is sort of habituation, and so on, but this confirming cognition is an important mechanism of change for exposure therapy. Or, for example, for doing cognitive diffusion in ACT or doing cognitive restructuring, modifying the believability, again, just confirming cognitions, is a key mechanism of change. So how you get to it, whether you just identify the cognition or you do exposure therapy or you restructure the cognition, the central key there for change is modifying the ability as one of the mechanisms.
Right. See, so I think one of the things that we fail to do in CBT is to clearly identify the mechanism of change.
Right.
And I think that, in the study that I talked about that we're doing in generalized anxiety disorder, we found that with, let's say, 3/4 of our data collected, that ACT and REBT have similar mechanisms of change. In other words, we had Steve Hayes say, these are the mechanism of change measures for ACT, and here's the mechanisms of change for REBT, and we had somebody else say, there's a mechanism of change for cognitive therapy. Cognitive therapy changes negative automatic thoughts, but not the measures of experiential avoidance from ACT or irrational beliefs, and vice versa. ACT changes its mechanisms and irrational beliefs, and REBT changes its. So that there may be more than one mechanism of change.
Well, there might be many.
That's right, and there may be many. And what we have not thought of is, I came across rereading a study by Mark Reineke on kids who relapsed from the TAD study of cognitive therapy for depression in kids. And one of the things that predicts his relapse is problem-solving skills. And so maybe what we would eventually do is say, here are the cognitive behavioral mechanisms of change, and develop a battery for this, our own assessment instrument. And we would say, take this measure of cognitive flexibility of ACT and irrational beliefs and negative automatic thoughts and problem-solving scores and negative schema, and then see what is really deficit in this client and maybe target. Rather than, because people usually do schema-focused cognitive therapy or REBT or cognitive therapy, and they do it all the time, rather than focusing on the mechanism of change that's operating in that client. And what we haven't done is develop sort of a client individual measure that would identify the mechanism of change most related to their problem. And we might be able to increase our effectiveness if we had that kind of interaction. So I think you're right. And one of my suggestions is, I sort of said this laughingly, is I think studies that have identified the mechanism of change should be more than empirically supported treatments. They should be at a higher level.
Right, exactly.
Right? They should be at a higher level because they tell us something more than just that this works. Okay, we'll have another question.
Do you think those mechanisms of change can be at one point agreed by different types of therapies or different theories?
I think we're a tremendously tribal organization, and I think people, I have this theory, share. I think that, if you go back to the early history of humans, we had a group of people wandering around the savannah of Africa, and when they got to a certain size, they split off into different groups. I think the same happens with cognitive behavior therapists. You have a certain size, and then the DBT people will split off, and then when they get to a certain size, they'll probably split into two different groups. There'll be the ABCT people, and then and so that we tend to split off, and that most people in our field, they do measures of one cognitive mediational method to say, I did this therapy and I measured this path of mediation, but I don't know whether problem solving also increased or that the underlying schema also changed, and we don't really compare multiple theories. And I think we tend to have, it goes back to sort of Karl Popper. I'm a sort of a big fan of Karl Popper, who said you have to falsify a hypothesis. And you can't falsify a hypothesis if you just confirm that what you think is there. You got to show that maybe another measure also accounts for it, or maybe accounts for it better. And so I think that our science is a little bit more too confirmatory rather than testing different mechanisms. And if each study was required to test 2 different mechanisms of change, and we found that this intervention changed this mechanism and that mechanism, or only this mechanism, we'd probably learn more than doing the one we already believe in. Okay. All right, thank you very much for staying late.
Thanks, everyone. I just want to say real briefly that, obviously thanks very much, Ray. It was a wonderful talk. And I did say this sort of the board for NYC-CBT will regret this lost opportunity, right? If you're not a member of NYC-CBT, think about joining. Go to the website, get in touch. There's a really great growing community here. And if you are a member, get a friend to join. So we can have more of these wonderful.
And there was in the 80s a New York Behavior Therapy Society that sort of faded out. Barry Lebetkin and Steve Fishman sort of ran it for a good while, and then it sort of died out at the end of the 80s. And so this is really a great thing to be reborn. All right? Thank you.